Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Larry Lederman, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the first of 6 sessions of our Global Policy Forum on behalf of CIGI in Ottawa. It's now my pleasure to invite the former director of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs of Carleton University, currently Chancellor's Professor at Carleton University, and Distinguished Fellow and Director of the Global Security Research Program at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation, Dr. Fen Hampson, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, Larry, for that generous introduction. I'm learning that at some point everybody becomes a former. It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Domenico Lombardi, who is Director of CIGI's Global Economy Program, where he oversees the research and direction of global economy and related activities at CIGI. He wears a number of hats. He's also chair of the Oxford Institute for Economic Policy, vice chair of New Rules for Global Finance Coalition, and he sits on the advisory boards of the Bretton Woods Committee in Washington, the G20 Research Group and G8 Research Groups at the University of Toronto, and the Istituto Affari Internazionali. Is that all right? Perfect. In Rome. He's a member of the Financial Times Forum of Economists. You've probably seen his articles in the FT, and editor of the World Economics Journal. Prior to coming to CIGI, Dr. Lombardi was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute in Washington, or institution. It's not an institute, it's an institution. In 2011, he was rapporteur of the high-level panel on governance of the Financial Stability Board, chaired, as you know, by Mark Carney. A year earlier, he was appointed by the World Bank's Group Board of Directors as the external reviewer to conduct the first independent review of the group's oversight and accountability units. His distinguished career includes positions on the executive boards of both the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. He has a very distinguished publishing record. He has also testified many times before the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, and the Subcommittee on Security and International Trade and Finance. And I dare say he has, or will shortly be, appearing before the House of Commons Foreign Affairs committees. He has an undergraduate degree in banking and finance from Bocconi University in Milan, and a PhD in economics from Oxford University. There's more, but I'm not going to say it. It's a great pleasure, and please give a warm welcome to Dr. Lombardi.
Thank you very much, Fen. I hope I'm not going to disappoint you after this very generous introduction. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I was here last time 3 or 4 weeks ago, and at that time we sort of previewed the G20 Summit, which was going to take place a few days later in St. Petersburg. And at that time, you know, essentially, I made 3 points. The first, that leaders would be discussing a relatively broad agenda, essentially going from the reform of the international financial architecture, the global economy, to climate change, multilateral trade, an unusually broad spectrum of issues. And in fact, the final communique consisted of 27 pages, a little bit more than 26, depending on how you count them. The second point I made here at the Rideau Club was that there wouldn't be hard deliverables or immediate deliverables. And just, to give you an example, clearly, the London summit at the height of the international crisis was, of course, a very productive summit. But even if you go 1 year behind, last year at Los Cabos, we did see some sort of concrete deliverables. A number of both G20 and non-G20 members did commit overall approximately $500 billion of US dollars in terms of additional financing to the IMF to help ring-fence the euro area crisis and the spillovers to the rest of the global economy. So as it was foreseen, this summit has been a little bit different. I would say that the leaders were more in a dialogue mode rather than action mode. And therefore, I thought that a presentation on the state of the economy should first of all start from what the leaders discussed in St. Petersburg, what kind of decisions they took or they did not take, and what sort of implications this may have for the world economy, but especially, to what extent the decisions they took are really new, are really sort of add really something to what we knew already. And I think on that we're going to have, some surprises. And of course, this very much reflects, this approach, of course, very much reflects the fact that I work at CIGI, and the global economy program, which I lead, of course, given the CIGI missions, CIGI's mandate is very much at the boundary between global governance and the global economy. So everything we do has to do with this interaction. On the one hand, the global or lack of thereof, global governance arrangements, and on the other, what implications this may bear in terms of global economic developments. And therefore, again, starting from the St. Petersburg summit, we know that leaders did talk a lot about potential growth, how to raise the rate of potential growth. So we'll go, in a moment, we'll go through why this is important, why this matters. And of course, in talking about raising the rate of potential growth, they did focus on the importance of structural reforms, global competitiveness, but also fiscal sustainability and how to reduce an increasing pile of public debt. I mean, clearly this is not, this may not be an issue so much here in Canada, but again, from the slides I'm going to show you, this is certainly an issue for many other countries within the G20. Before I start the presentation, I would also like to emphasize 2 points. The first is that, this emphasis on structural reforms marks really a shift in the G20 narrative vis-a-vis, previous summits, previous G20 meetings. This marks a shift because it is really an evolution from the more politically charged narrative of current account rebalancing that was really too close to the US-China bilateral agenda, and the idea of moving towards, elaborating the need for more structural reforms. It doesn't change overall the economics of the issue, but I think puts the overall issue on a more technocratic, I would say less politically charged ground or narrative. And, if we were really to say, if we were to ask the most, I think one of the most intriguing questions, would the G20 really add something to what actually leaders have decided in St. Petersburg? On that, I would really leave a question mark for the moment, because it's not clear what sort of give and take might be materializing within a G20. Leaders stressed the importance of fiscal sustainability, reining in the massive amount of public debt. But to be honest, a number of G20 economies have already committed to do so. The Eurozone economies have signed up to the Fiscal Compact Treaty, a treaty that compels them to run a balanced budget in structural terms, at least. And for the highly indebted economies within the Eurozone, those economies will have to reduce their excessive debt by 1/20 each year. And the excessive debt is deemed to be whatever comes on top of over 60%. So if you take the case of Italy, right now, the public debt over GDP is spiking at roughly 130%. The excessive debt that needs to be reined in over 20 years is roughly 70% of GDP. And so, this is not really new. If you take the case of Japan, at the other end of the spectrum, Japan is hitting this year 240, 250 debt over GDP ratio, and has committed to achieve a primary surplus by 2020. That's in the G20 communique, as well as reducing the public debt thereafter. Again, if we talk about structural reforms, this is really, I would say, the most salient point, because the BRICS economies, the emerging economies, have been really providing a lot of the global growth that we all have been enjoying. And therefore, in order for the BRICS economies to keep this same pace of contributing to global growth, they do need to introduce a wide range of structural reforms so that their potential growth rate would not fade over time, but would would still continue to be sustainable at current rates. And this is even more true for advanced economies. If many of the advanced economies within the G20 have a rate of potential growth that oscillates around 2%. And if you compare that with the BRICS, with other more dynamic economies, clearly this has to be increased, especially for those economies that are going through fiscal adjustment, and will need to reduce that over time. Sorry for this, I just wanted to give you a broader context for this presentation. I have a few more slides, and I'm going to touch on some of the aspects I already mentioned, just to give you a little bit of a more precise idea about trends, dynamics, and composition of the trends we're going to look at. So, as I was mentioning a minute ago, Next year, the IMF projects a global growth rate of a little bit less than 4%. Now, this 4% is contributed by the BRICS for a measure close to 2%, almost half. The United States is gonna contribute by a little bit, something in the neighborhood of 0.5%. The euro area, of course, is contributing less and less. And why is that? Well, one of the reasons is, of course, that the shares of the global economy contribution by the various countries have been changing over time. If we look at this at these two very simple pie charts, they just take photos of how the various regions or countries were contributing to the global economy in 2004, and how they are projected to contribute next year. Well, we see a very clear pattern that the BRICS now, essentially Brazil, Russia, India, China, they account for about 50% of the entire global economy. And therefore, this explains also why, given their very large share of the global economy, why their rate of growth, does matter for all of us. Then we see that the United States has, of course, come down a bit. Canada has managed to keep its own position in relative terms, And of course, the euro area is the biggest loser. Its share of the global economy has reduced by 2/3. So in a way, the only good news to that is that when we hear that the euro area is not going to grow a lot or is going to stay flat, well, in a way, the weight of the euro area in the global economy has been reduced, and therefore it should matter a little bit less to all of us. But I think the most important takeaway from this slide is that even within the BRICS, it's really China that has been growing at a spectacular rate, and as a result of that, in almost 10 years, it is projected to double its own share of the global, in the global economy. And in fact, because of that, we have run some simulations, some very basic simulations. Of course, everybody now talks about what may be happening if China's growth slows down. So on purpose, we have taken as a base case scenario what the IMF was projecting with the latest WEO publication last April. At that time, the IMF was assuming that China would essentially grow at a rate of 8.5%. By now, of course, this is, I think this seems to be really overestimating the trajectory of the Chinese economy over the coming years. I think right now, we should expect something between 7.5%. The World Bank has just come out with a projected rate of growth around 7.5%, and I would expect the IMF to fall in the same neighborhood when it releases the new set of projections in early October in the context of the forthcoming IMF annual meetings. But what we do see is that clearly, if China's growth fall down to 7%, this knocks off growth by 25 basis points per year, in terms of global GDP growth. If China further slows down to even 4 or 5%, then the impact on global economic growth can be estimated in the neighborhood of 80 basis points, something close to 1 percentage point, but not quite. However, if you add a slowdown of the BRICS economy, so not just China, but if you add up India, Brazil, and Russia, and you assume that they would be growing over the coming years at a rate of about 4%, this is going to knock off a full 1 percentage point from the estimated, the projected world economy growth rate. So this is why, as I said, BRICS do matter, and this is why there is a lot of pressure in the context of the G20 to make sure that the BRICS will be growing at a high enough rate to compensate for the sluggishness of many of the advanced economies. And in fact, just talking about advanced economies, what we have done here is to project the potential growth rate, the weighted potential growth rate among all the advanced G20 economies, and then compare this with the actual, actual projections. So this is the projections of the potential growth rate. That is a sort of average rate at which an economy is expected to grow under reasonable assumptions. And then this is how much an economy actually turns out to grow. And of course, these are all forecasts from 2013 onwards. So I think here we can observe two things. The first is that actual growth is systematically projected to be higher than the potential rate of growth. And Number two, that the potential rate of growth is pretty low. And therefore, this has a number of implications, especially if many of these economies, not all, but many of these economies, will have to fiscally consolidate over the coming years. On the other hand, if we look at the emerging G20 economies, and again, this is a weighted average of the potential rate of growth for the emerging economies, and this is a weighted average of the actual rate of growth, the blue line. Here again, we observe two things. The first is that, once again, the actual rate of growth is projected to be systematically higher than the rate of potential growth. Number two, the second observation that I would draw from this is that even if you take the potential real GDP growth, this is pretty high. This is several times higher than what the advanced economies can afford. And I think this is really the key, to understand why the slowdown, the sharp slowdown at the height of the international financial crisis and the immediate post-crisis period has been much better or less harsh than it would have otherwise been. So, I was saying at the outset that it is really important for the advanced economies, A, to raise their own potential rate of growth, of course, but also to make sure that the emerging economies do keep growing at this very high rate, whether it's actual or whether it's potential. It's very high, and they do need to generate a global demand, which many of the advanced economies appear not to be doing, and especially owing to the crisis in the Eurozone, fiscal consolidation, both in the Eurozone as well as in the United States, also to a less extent. If we have to sort of take a snapshot of how countries, in terms of how countries do vis-a-vis structural reforms, clearly it's not something easily, the aggregate performance on structural reforms is not easily measurable, like I would say the rate of inflation, or even the rate of GDP growth. But I think one easy benchmark is what the World Bank has done with the survey on the ease of doing business. So essentially, they try to capture how easy it is to do business in a given country. And they look at a number of regulatory aspects. Out of fairness, I should say that there are some methodological questions, as it is always the case with anything that has to do with economics. But that said, I do think that this survey gives a very powerful snapshot in terms of how countries perform in terms of how much they are able to attract investment. And what we do see from these slides is essentially the World Bank, out of 185 countries, survey all these 185 countries, and these are the rankings. So the United States is the fourth out of these 185 countries. Canada does pretty well. It's essentially the fifth economy within the G20. And what we see, the broader trend we see here is that in the first decile, on this side of the table, essentially we see that the advanced economies tend to be rated relatively high, with some exception, of course. And on the other hand, we see that the emerging economies tend to appear in the lowest decile, and again with some exceptions. Italy is of course that exception. So in a way, if you do point to the need of structural reforms chances are that these countries will have to do more homework than the first group, than the first decile. Again, the World Bank does provide this ranking, and this ranking is clearly a very crude measure of how an economy performs vis-a-vis another one in terms of regulatory barriers. But it tells you very little in terms of how you're doing over time, because if 1 year Canada is, appears to be the 17th in the overall ranking, and then the following year, it becomes the 15th, you don't really know whether it's Canada that is getting better or the others that are getting worse. And therefore, sort of to address this, this issue, again, the World Bank has elaborated a measure. It's called Progress to Frontier, and it gives you so 100 is the best possible performance, and then you are able to see how countries are doing, what sort of progress they are making in terms of attaining the best possible performance, and this slide, this chart only features the emerging economies, because I think this is most relevant to the purpose of this talk. And here we do see two things, I would say. First, they tend, their own starting base tend to be relatively lower. I didn't want to overload you with a lot of slides, but if you look at the same pictures for the advanced economies, they tend to start from much higher. So clearly they start from a lower starting point, as of course can be easily expected. And there is some progress for many. Although, if you take the case of China, this progress tends to be quite steady. For others, it tends to be a little bit flat. Even, in the outer years, if you take the case of Brazil, you do see even a worsening, essentially a downward path in terms of this rate of progress. So instead of moving forward, Brazil is moving backward. But overall, what you see is that they start from a relatively low base, and they do make some progress, and certainly they will need to do sort of more reforms in terms to attain the same level of regulatory environment that many of the advanced economies can already rely on. And of course, this gives you an idea whenever the G20 says, attaches importance to structural reforms, essentially where the burden is gonna fall, primarily. This is as far as structural reforms are concerned. We have seen, how the potential growth rates look like. Again, the advanced economies do relatively poorly. The emerging economies have been doing pretty well. The other item that was discussed by the G20 leaders is fiscal consolidation. And here you might recall that initially there was the idea that the G20 could commit to some specific targets in terms of reducing the debt to GDP ratios to certain threshold. Canada was certainly in that camp. Germany was also in that camp. The United States had a somewhat different position. The United States was in favor for, didn't want to pre-commit to a specific targets. Well, in the end, what we did notice in St. Petersburg was that leaders were able to manage a sort of compromise where they do agree to fiscal consolidation, to reducing the debt to GDP ratios over the medium term, but they did not commit to any specific threshold. So in a way, this was the price of the compromise. But let's have a look at how this debt to GDP ratio has been evolving in advanced G20 economies. And again, we have taken a weighted average of the advanced G20 economies, and we're going to compare with the same weighted average for the emerging economies, again, to estimate where the burden is going to fall and to what extent, this is really something I'm going to wrap up at the end, so to what extent we can deem this compromise, the thrust of this compromise achieved by the G20 really credible and you know, sort of achievable. So here we see that the debt among the advanced G20 economies is on an upward trajectory, except for a relatively minor decrease in 2006 and 2007, but then it is on a steady upward trend. It peaks in 2013, and then it is projected to slowly decrease in the outer years. If we look at the same graph for the emerging economies, we see I would say, a symmetrically opposite picture. So we see that you know, the debt to GDP ratios in the, again, this is a weighted average of the emerging economies within the G20, is on a relatively steady downward trajectory. It spikes in 2002 due to the effects of the Argentinian crisis. Then it spikes again around at the height of the international financial crisis, because some of these countries implemented some you know, of course, stimulus policies that fed back into higher debt. But other than that, this is very much on a downward trajectory and is projected to fall more and more, especially in the outer years. This graph sort of, you know, provides you a little bit more elements. What has really been contributing to these dynamics in the debt to GDP ratio in the advanced economies? Here we see that you know, the spike was largely determined by an economic contraction. Clearly, when the GDP falls, you have you know, a spike in the debt to GDP ratios, and then again, you have, of course, deficits, budget deficits that add to the debt. What you see here is that essentially these deficits will be decreasing over time, and that growth will be making a positive contribution to the reduction of growth. However, what you also do see is that the rate of improvement in terms of reducing the debt to GDP ratio is going to be very, very slow, very modest. And this is why you know, achieving a higher rate of growth would really be instrumental to make this, I think, more credible and less painful. Again, if we look at the same picture, the same chart for the emerging G20 economies, we see that you know, the reduction in the debt to GDP ratios is stronger than in the advanced economies, and that of course, you know, these countries can, despite their relatively low debt to GDP ratios, will still be you know, reducing their debt exposure. So, and this leads to really to the final point, and I hope I'm staying within the time that has been allotted. You know, on the one hand, we have essentially one aspect of this G20 consensus that talks about fiscal consolidation, but this is something that the many advanced economies have already embarked on. This is something that you know, many G20 advanced economies have already started doing. It's already ingrained in their policies. It's not a new commitment. It's not something that has really materialized in St. Petersburg. What St. Petersburg did was really maybe to bring to bear, to provide more emphasis to these already taken nationally drawn commitments. And this is really something that is of concern more to the advanced economies than to the emerging economies. So it's not something that, you know, in a way, the advanced economies can offer to the emerging economies. A, because they have already pre-committed to that, and B, because given their very large debt to GDP ratios, it's something they would need to do anyway. On the other hand, we see that the emerging G20 economies have already embarked on a consistent fiscal consolidation path, and in any case, their debt to GDP ratios are, already very low. So it's not something that, in a way, can be offered as a sort of, give and take from the advanced economies to the emerging economies. On the other hand, if we look at structural reforms, this is something that the emerging economies, of course, need to do a little bit more in a pervasive way. But this is also something that the advanced economies will need to achieve based on their very low potential growth rate, as we have seen in one of the previous slides. So it's not clear where what is really gonna drive, what is really gonna give momentum to this new G20 process. Really, it looks like more a summation of nationally drawn actions and policies, more than something that really adds to the global economic discourse. One more thing before I wrap up. Again, this was something that we had an opportunity to discuss a few weeks ago. And we noticed that there would be no real progress on the issue of IMF reform. Again, the communique did pay some attention to that in passing, but it is now clear that the Seoul reform package has been derailed, still awaits confirmation, ratification by the US Congress, but most importantly, the new quota review that was scheduled to be finalized by January of next year almost surely will be postponed at a later moment. I think this goes well beyond the importance of the IMF as an international institution. Clearly, in this type of international negotiations, you do need something that provides, helps to build a climate of trust, provides an immediate deliverable. And I think, earlier on, I would say till last summit, the one in Los Cabos, the issue, the momentum around IMF reform was very relevant, very instrumental in terms of propping up this G20 consensus. Right now, it's not clear what may be really catalyzing, the attention of G20 members, what sort of immediate deliverable might forge this climate of trust, of trust that is needed in this type of international forums to be effective. And with that, I think I will stop here. I hope I've been within my allotted time, and I would be happy to respond to any question you might have. Thank you.
I'm Len Edwards, former Sherpa, and someone who's watched the G20 very carefully since the very beginning. Thank you very much for your presentation. It pretty much, I think, sums up certainly my views on what's happened. But I wanted to ask you one question. How much do you think in St. Petersburg was the reaction of the advanced economies in the United States in particular to this complaint? How far did it go? I read the communique, but I'm interested in your point of view. And did it go anywhere to building some climate of trust going forward?
I was in St. Petersburg, so I could sort of breathe a little bit the atmosphere and the sense of frustration that many seem to experience. And what I was surprised is not just the fact that clearly emerging economies were complaining about the fact that systemically important central banks do not incorporate the spillovers of their policies to the rest of the global economy. And I think for a forum like the G20 that has self-attributed the role of a premier forum for international economic cooperation, there might be a slight tension in that. But I think the most important point I noticed is that on the one hand, emerging economies were really unhappy and were really, were underscoring this tension. On the other, if you read the communique, it's not, I don't think it pays justice to that sense of frustration. And of course, there is no easy solution. As I said, the tension is really embedded in the fact that on the one hand, we have a global economy, on the other, we have nation-based policy making in many respects. But I think that in a way, the G20 failed to even try to build a bridge. And I think this is really one of the aspects that one should really be unhappy of. Clearly, again, there is no easy fix. There are ways to maybe to try to build stronger safety nets, global safety nets. There are ways to mobilize the attention of policymakers, both in advanced economies, but also in emerging economies through stronger macroprudential frameworks. But what I would have expected in the first instance would have been a communique where there would have been a little bit more empathy, if I may use this term, to the instances put forward by many emerging economies, and I think for the right reason.
I have a question regarding the potential growth graphs that you showed us. The first one was that, just to my eye, there's no clear indication that the real GDP growth is going to exceed the potential GDP growth. It seems to go back and forth. And secondly, regarding particularly emerging G20 economies, after 2013, there seems to not be very much of a correlation between the potential real GDP growth and the forecasted real GDP growth. Could you elaborate a bit on?
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, these are projections made by the IMF. I think it goes back and forth for the realized data so far, but that's not the case for the projected data. And my comments were referring actually to the years, to the coming years for which the IMF has indeed made this projection. But I do, I do confirm, I think the main thrust of those projections, that is first, based on the IMF assessment, the projected actual rate of growth is still going to be higher than the rate of potential growth. And in any case, the rate of potential growth is substantially different, is exceedingly different between advanced economies and emerging economies. And I think, in a world where you go, say, 10 kilometers an hour and others go to 50 kilometers an hour, I think this should raise some concern.
Just a quick question on the IMF. You suggested the IMF quota reform is on ice right now. What do you think is going to what will be required to get that back on track, especially in the terms of the kind of compromise we need to see between the emerging members of the G20 and the current rich countries in the G20? Yeah,
as you know, this IMF reform package was endorsed by the G20 leaders in Seoul. It was November 2010, and they established themselves a deadline of October 2012 in order to ratify the same package. Now it's we are 1 year later, and essentially the reform has not been enacted because the US Congress has still to ratify it. I think this goes well beyond whether the US Congress is going to ratify it or not and when. It has undermined that sense of trust. And it has also deprived the G20 of that sort of momentum that has characterized, its early decision, its early consultations. So, of course, because the US Congress has still to consider the package, it is unfeasible for the IMF membership to move forward to the next stage. Because it is just, it would just be politically awkward that while Congress would be considering a certain package, with certain parameters, then the membership would agree on something that comes on top of that. And clearly, these are conversations that are very delicate in the current context in Washington. On the one hand, you are asking Congress to decide on certain appropriations, and then at the same time, Congress might learn that there are other negotiations that will require further appropriations. So I don't think that first the administration is willing to back this request with all the political capital needed. And secondly, I don't think this is just feasible in the current context where not even the basic parameters of the public budget in the US are settled. And of course, the IMF is a kind of second-order issue to all that. So what I think is that, there is no end in sight, at least at this moment. Any approval of the Seoul package is not likely to be immediate, but hopefully I may be wrong. And secondly, what is certainly true is that the deadline that the G20 had set, together with the IMF governance bodies, of January 2014 for a further package of governance reforms, that is definitely on the back burner. And I think this, although the G20 officials sometimes dispute whether it's a G20 matter or it's an IMF matter, in the end, the G20 did provide all its political capital for these discussions. And not fulfilling those discussions till the end, of course, undermines the credibility of the G20 itself. And B, I would say challenges, that climate of trust, of understanding that was so good in the early days of the G20 summits, and really made the G20 consultations appear to be working for everybody.
My name is Patrick Dion, and there's no risk of me becoming the current or the former dean of the Norman Paterson School, but I am fascinated by this in a way that I suppose will betray the more micro-level question to the presentation you put before us. And that really is to the question of China's influence on the global economy, and you had a slide there that gave the different scenarios in terms of the world, the effect of the Chinese economy affecting, indeed, the global economy. What risk factors stand in between China, let's say, achieving that highest rate of growth? Hope is not a strategy, but I think there's lots of countries, even beyond the G20, that hope that China continues to progress as it does, and I'm just kind of curious to know what, in your estimation, stands in between China achieving its full potential.
I think the performance that we have seen now of the Chinese economy in the recent years is really, quite exceptional, in the sense that we should expect certainly a lower rate of growth in the coming years. I think a lot will also depend to what extent the Chinese economy will be relying on export-led growth model, as it has been doing so far. As we know, the European Union is the largest export market, and of course, this is creating, a substantial slowdown in terms of export opportunities for China. But I think a lot will depend to what extent, this adjustment that we are currently seeing in the Chinese data does reflect a sort of conjunctural drive or a more structural drive. I think to the extent this reflects a more structural transformation, then we are more likely to see a Chinese economy growing at a steady rate. Again, it's not going to be like the one we are used to, but couldn't be, it wouldn't be substantially different. Of course, if China doesn't really manage to adjust the mix of the demand for its own products, between a domestic-led component and a foreign-led component, of course, the US is going to fiscally consolidate, and there is no doubt. Europe is already heavily cutting on demand, and therefore it's going to be different to imagine where the sources of growth for the Chinese exports is going to come from.
Just a quick question. I'm Barry McLaughlin. I'm not an economist. I'm not even an accountant, but I do have a question. When you look at the Western economies, including Canada, and you see their contribution to the global growth, do we have any reason to be complacent? You know, you mentioned in here, for example, that the chart shows that Canada's number 17 on the rank of ease of doing business, which actually surprised me a little bit. Australia's number 10. I guess my question is there a message in this to countries such as Canada? Is it just steady as she goes, or what should we be doing more or less of in order to improve this situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, clearly Canada, in the context of the G20, compares pretty well. We have seen that Canada is the fifth economy in terms of ease of doing business. If we look at the share of Canada in the global economy, we see that everybody else has been doing worse. Their shares have reduced. That's certainly true for the euro area. That's, of course, the worst performance ever. But even if you take the case of the United States, the US has indeed lost a few percentage points in the overall pie, while Canada has managed to remain, 1% at 1% share. So I would say, clearly this is already a good result in itself. On fiscal, in terms of fiscal matters, the Canadian authorities have already committed, I would say even pre-committed, to what the G20 has actually decided on. There is room for improving, but vis-a-vis the other G7 economies, I would say Canada, is doing very well. And certainly the fact that it was not hit by the international economic crisis, I would also add this is a very important factor, because many of these economies, in the end, we're not doing so badly in terms of their public finances before the crisis. It was really the crisis that made those economies, to increase public debt, fiscal deficits. And therefore, once you start doing so, you do get into a kind of vicious spiral. Canada was spared, certainly for its own merit, but the point is that, Canada is doing pretty well within the G20. Certainly, if I could add something, if we look at the rate of potential growth, it's about 2%, as as the IMF has estimated. And again, maybe there could be policies to enact in order to lift further that rate. Once again, if we were to benchmark that rate vis-a-vis some European countries, we would be pleased. But on the other hand, the bar could be set higher.
Well, thank you very much. It falls upon me to thank Domenico for his excellent presentation today. I think after this presentation, we can all see why CIGI was so wise as to hire Domenico. Your presentation was truly enlightening. It certainly helped me as a non-economist to understand the complexities of the very dense language of the 27-page communique, and I think it helped everyone to understand the communique much better. So on behalf of all of us here, I'd like to thank you, Domenico, and we all look forward to reading your commentaries and your blogs in future, and to hearing a lot more from you in the CIGI presentations here in the future at the Rideau Club. So thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.